Okay, so lesson 2 of our first part of the topic is thinking about the challenges that the Tsarist regime actually faced, which then led up to the 1905 revolution, which we'll look at in a little bit more detail as we go. So, learning intention for this, we're starting to think about reasons why the Tsarist regime ultimately would collapse in February 1917. So that's kind of the main learning intention for this. To give you some background, again, we're still in the Russia and Revolution area of the topic, and our 3 success criteria points that you are looking at is, can you explain a little bit more about how Russia actually looked? Do you know who the people that were involved actually are? And can you describe ultimately what a revolution is, or has your ideas behind revolution actually changed from the first lesson? Reading assignment for this one is chapter 1 from pages 4 to 27 in the textbook. Again, the digital copy of the textbook is available on the Teams and website, so please, if you haven't done that already and gone and gotten that, definitely make sure you've got a copy saved on your computer or your hard drive or whatever you're saving it on, because you will be using it, and you will be using it for tasks and things as we go. So, overview of Russia in general. We know that they are ruled by the Tsars, which is sometimes spelt with the C but meaning the same thing, and that it is an autocracy. So it's epitomised basically under the control of one person who is in complete control of everything. And the best example that we probably have in sort of the recent period that we're looking at of what an autocrat really looks like is Alexander III. So he is the one that is in charge before Nicholas. It's Nicholas's father. He's very stringent about the rules and what he thinks an autocracy should look like, but we'll come back to that. However, following his death, Russia is in a period where the rest of the world is starting to modernise, and if they want to remain this major world power that they have been up to this point, then they are going to have to modernise as well. Now, be careful when we think about modernisation. We don't just mean modernising in terms of the industry and the economy, we also mean in terms of the democracy and the way of education and things as well. Now, obviously, this idea of modernisation creates quite serious challenges for the Tsars, who pretty much just want to change in general their country, but don't want to alter any aspect of the political administrative framework that they've got going on. So they basically want it to stay as it is, but also somehow modernise at the same time. And if you think back to what Sean Lang discussed in the chapter overview that we looked at, that isn't really going to work. He talks about the peasants not feeling valued and feeling a bit disconnected then from the centre and the control, which will ultimately become a problem again later on. All of the challenges that they face, though, don't just come from the peasants. There's lots of different groups in Russian society, and in particular there's this growing political opposition from this kind of liberal middle-class group who want a real change in the way that Russia is governed, not just in Russia and in life in general in Russia. They want the government of Russia to be completely different and to be changed in some way. So, a good starting point is to think about why Alexander III was this epitome of autocracy. Now, his father, Alexander II, had been quite a revolutionary thinker in some ways in terms of what he actually wanted for his country. He had been assassinated on the 13th of March, 1881, and this was done by a revolutionary terrorist group. He was autocratic, but he was a reformist as well, in that he made some small improvements that were quite welcome to life in Russia and eased some of the oppression that the people were actually living under. When he was murdered, his son, Alexander III, took over, and he saw these sort of reformist things as being one of the fundamental reasons why his father had been targeted. It made him look weak, and he refused to rule a country that would be weak, or he would be seen as a weak leader of. So what he did when he took power was he reversed all of the gains that had been made under Alexander II, and he repressed the people even further through a series of other legislation to try and make sure that they never would again try to rise up against this almighty leader. This assassination of Alexander is a really important turning point in Russian history, because after this point it's really very clear that the Tsarist regime is already starting to look quite vulnerable and is generally quite underdeveloped compared to the other nations of the Western European area at this point in time. The times definitely are changing, and the problem is that the fate of the Romanov dynasty and family really rest on their ability, or at least Alexander III and then Nicholas's ability, to change with the times for the sake of their country. But they're not willing to do that, and there are a few reasons why that was actually difficult. The first is that Russia is difficult to govern in general as a country. The second, the people of Russia themselves are not actually all Russian, so that's a bit difficult as well. The regime itself and the structure of it needs to fundamentally change in order for anything to move forward, which again, very difficult, and there is general opposition starting to develop, which makes any changes they do difficult as well. So, two kind of points for you to keep in mind as we're going through this. Under Alexander III, between 1881 and 1905, there is this period of political repression. The Tsars, Alexander III and then his son Nicholas II, will suppress groups such as things like the Socialist Revolutionaries and the Social Democrats, who are starting to develop and demand some sort of reform. The second problem and issue that they have is industrialisation. It does see a period of major economic changes as Russia goes through a rapid industrialisation process. However, they do not modernise, and the modernisation idea is not actually overly popular with ordinary people at this point in time. So it is key to think about this idea of how big Russia really is. Okay, huge country, which is similar to what we saw last lesson, with millions of people, all of them with different cultures. It's very difficult to govern that. And as a method of trying to control that, a period of suppression was characterised by something called Russification. Pretty much Alexander III and his advisor promoted this policy, and it was to try and just make everything Russian. You would be Russian, and that would be what you were, and that would be the main thing that you were focused on. So in 1885, Russian became the official language. Everyone in the area, in the first map, everything in purple belongs to the Russian Empire. They would have to speak Russian. That was the first official language. Public office was closed to anyone that didn't speak it fluently, so if you wanted to be in any sort of position of authority where your voice could be heard, or you could maybe make some changes, you had to speak Russian fluently, even if that was not your native language. The Russian majority's rights were put before any other of the groups, so it might be minority groups and things like that. If you were part of these other countries involved in this Russian Federation at the point in time, the actual main point of Russia would always take precedence to you and to your country's needs, or whatever it might be. And Alexander didn't distinguish between minority groups who were traditionally loyal to him and to Tsarism, for example the Finns, or groups who were opposed to it, like the Poles or the Muslims of Central Asia. He treated all of minority groups the same, and it was not a particularly nice way that he did actually treat them. So because of this, it seemed to the people not to matter about what they did. They were always going to be treated unfairly, and this increased opposition to Tsarism from lots and lots of different sections of society, not just individual people, but more minority groups, which then were at all levels, from peasantry to these middle class groups and so on. And he didn't attempt any reform at all. Instead of being reformist, or even moderately reformist like his father had been, he was actually a reactionary person, and he was very inflexible, as documents in history has shown. Under Alexander's kind of rule, there were more liberal ministers sacked than had been previously. He got rid of anyone that was kind of more towards the liberal side, didn't want to hear from them at all. temporary regulations actually gave provisional governors and officials the power to imprison people without actual power. They could ban public meetings, and thousands of people were exiled to Serbia for being part of these meetings and things. The Ochrana, the secret police, restricted the press quite violently, and they monitored any revolutionary and socialist groups, and as you can imagine, that would not be looked on. So Alexander was quite heavily influenced by both his father's death and his tutor, who you can see pictured on the slide here. He did not think that his father's leniency, as he would have put it, or his slight reforms was the real true tradition of the Tsarist regime that had come previous and that should then come after. He was determined then that he was going to keep this tradition alive and that he would not be seen as weak like his father was in his eyes. So one of the ways that he actually did this was by trying to ensure that people that were in positions of any sort of authority were people that were loyal to him or that he had appointed. He did this first in 1889 when he took out the elected justices of the peace, people who were trying to keep order and things like that, and replaced them with a new thing, which he termed the land captains. Basically, aristocrats, people who were appointed by the Tsar, high members of society, quite wealthy, and very much in this kind of upper class group of people. They were given powers to overrule and basically take charge of the zemstas, which were the local councils, and they could charge peasants and things for minor offences without it having to go any further than that. The peasants didn't like this very much. They felt that the land captains treated them as badly as they had been during the years of serfdom, where they were all serfs, which they had obviously been freed from, and they didn't really like that at all. They were quite upset and felt very downtrodden about that. In 1890, the Tsar then restricted the right to vote for these local councils in the countryside, and 2 years later the right to vote for the Duma in the towns was restricted in a similar way. So the Duma is kind of very similar to these local councils, or almost like a pseudo parliament sort of thing if we compare it to what we are maybe used to in Britain. This pretty much gave the gentry, this upper class of people, even more power because they could now just basically do what they wanted, and that again meant that there was more opposition starting to grow, which was a major issue. On top of this, you've got the rights and privileges of the Russian Orthodox Church being championed above any other beliefs and things like that. Primary schools and primary levels of education were under church control. Jewish people suffered probably the most under this process of Russification, because anti-Semitism was actually common. Alexander III was a very well-known anti-Semitic person. It was quite common in Russia for Jews to be made a target by him. Jewish people weren't allowed to become doctors or lawyers. Very, very few were actually allowed to universities, and violent attacks, pogroms that we've discussed, you'll maybe remember from higher level in the Migration and Empire topic, were quite common, and they were very much present in Russia up to this point, but definitely increased during Alexander III's reign. There were over 200 of them during this point in time while he was in charge. So there are a lot of issues in Russia in general. We can actually define some of these main issues about why the Tsarist regime fell within this, but that is not to say that Alexander was the one completely to blame for that. He just picked up and kind of took things in a direction that would start like a domino effect that his son would then continue. So the long-term issues for the fall of the Tsars fall under these categories: the geography and size of Russia, the communications and issues with that, the people and the national groups, Russification, which we'll go back into, social structure, land and agriculture, industry, how Russia was actually governed, the weaknesses of the Tsar, for example, and how they dealt with opposition, the Russian Orthodox Church, the government's economic policy, and the Russo-Japanese War. Now, these are the things that ultimately will lead to first the 1905 revolution and then the downfall of the Tsar in February 1917. So we're going to look at these in more detail. If you were writing an essay about the long-term issues, these would be the kind of things that you would talk about as your paragraphs or the points that you would be looking to make. So in terms of the geography and size, in 1900 we were talking about Russia being this vast empire covering 2 continents across Europe and Asia. From west to east we've got 6,400 kilometres, and north to south it's over 3,500 kilometres. It takes up 1/6 of the world's total land mass. Basically, the United States could fit in it 2.5 times, and Britain could fit in it nearly 100 times. So there's a lot of land, a lot of space. Huge parts of it are uninhabited or are sparsely populated. The northern parts of it are frozen for most of the year. South of this you've got miles and miles of forest, and then you've got this like open grassland area, and then into the far south you've got desert. So you've got all of these different types of biomes existing within one landmass, which is fairly cool but very difficult to actually organise. If you actually look at the map on this slide, you can kind of see where the industrial areas were located in Russia. They're kind of all congregated in these one space, and you can see the differences of these areas and what they actually had. So you've got tundra, you've got the forest areas, there's sort of the grasslands and things like that. It's very, very sparsely populated in some areas, but very, very overpopulated in others. So this means actually trying to control this is very difficult. As you can imagine, communications was generally quite poor. There were very few paved roads outside of the main cities, so pretty much that area of industrial sort of development are the main sort of cities. Very few paved roads outside of this. The roads that they do have, a lot of them are just hard packed earth that when there's a lot of rainfall, or especially in the winter, just turns to mud and were just generally impassable. So for long journeys they use the rivers. That means that most of these major cities are going to grow up along the river routes, because obviously to get materials in and out it is the most beneficial spot to do. If you think about settlement site and situation all the way back from first year geography, then you can think about that in a bit more detail, why they would pick these particular areas to set up these cities. Railway was the other main form of travel, but it pretty much only had the same amount of rail track that Britain did at this point in time. So it's not an awful lot in general. What they have is the Trans-Siberian Railway. It's the most important piece of sort of rail in Russia. It crosses Russia from Moscow in the west all the way to Vladivostok in the east. It takes about a week to actually travel down, and you can see it on this map here. So the blue line is the Trans-Siberian Railroad, and you can actually see how big this actually is just in comparison with some other things in the same area in the world that you might know about. So the green line here is the sort of China Eastern Railroad that goes all the way across that. You've got the South Manchurian Railroad, again, major one that went this way. But really interestingly, the sheer size of this, to give you an idea, this sort of pink line here is the Great Wall of China. And I mean, it takes up like a quarter of the length of the Trans-Siberian Railway. So very, very, very important, but very long. So if you're in Moscow or St. Petersburg and you're trying to get any sort of communications and things like that across Russia, it takes at least a week on this railroad, if things are good, to get this information there. By the time it gets there, it's possibly out of date, and there's no way of easy communication back and forth with the centre or with the industrial areas. It's also quite expensive things to move goods across Russia. A lot of the time, the sort of further parts of Russia would be left to their own devices and governed by local councils, so they don't really pay much attention to those over there in the other direction because it's too far away really, and they're not overly interested. But this will lead to a lot of opposition and a lot of issues later on, because they are being controlled by St. Petersburg and by Moscow, which is a very distant reality for some people at this point. There's also the fact about the people. They aren't able to communicate as effectively with one another because only 40% of the people actually speak Russian as their first language, and the Russian people themselves only form about a half of the overall population who are living in the European part, really. Some of these people, the Cossacks in particular, are loyal to the Tsarist regime. Others, for example, the Poles and Finns, hated the Russian rule because, again, minorities being treated exactly the same whether they're loyal or not. Jews, we've talked about, were subjected to these really awful racial prejudice and persecution attacks, which were sponsored by the government quite openly and were a very large population. And the diversity of culture and religion and language really is just astonishing. There's sophisticated Europeans on one side, and then there's this sort of like nomadic group in the deserts to these very native tribes in the Siberian wilderness. It's kind of like capturing not only all of the different biomes, but kind of all of the different states of developed groupings that you could at this point in time. So there's lots of different nationalities in Russia at this point in time. You can see in the table there all of the different languages and things that are actually spoken. It's very difficult to actively communicate so effectively with people in your country when so many of them don't even speak the language that the centre does, or are just not interested in what the centre is actually doing. They don't see themselves necessarily as being Russia, but they are obviously part of this empire. So the empire, obviously, we talked about being built up over centuries, but some of the areas really had only been added in the 19th century. By the beginning of the 20th, it's this huge empire containing all of these different national groups. Russians as an ethnic group made up about half of the population. A vast majority of them are living in the European part, and the huge diversity of culture and things like that meant, as we said, it was very difficult to ignore. This means that the size and diversity of the empire made it very difficult to govern and control for any sort of leader. Whether they were a good leader or a bad leader, that would be very difficult for them to do. Many national minorities resented the Russian authority, so Russification was imposed as an attempt to keep control, as we've already said. The non-Russians had to use the Russian language, the clothes, they had to adopt Russian as kind of their main focus. They had to adopt Russian customs and things like that. Russian officials ran the regional governments. It was used in schools, in courts, in the regional governments and things, no matter where they were. It was forbidden to teach children the local language in some places, like in Poland, for example. All key jobs in the area would go to Russian people. And the minorities really saw this as a general attack on their way of life and a form of discrimination. A number of the nationalist groups revolted and they sought autonomy, which is, remember, the word for self-government in parts of the empire. They no longer wanted to be part of Russia. And it resulted ultimately in a mass rebellion in Poland, with the growth of nationalism amongst the minorities getting more and more developed as time went on, and the harsher that Tsar Alexander treated them and then Tsar Nicholas treated them. So the Tsarist regime starts to lose quite a lot of its loyal followers. There are boycotts of schools, churches, courts and things like that in Armenia and in Georgia, and there is rise in support for these revolutionary parties, not necessarily because they always agree on everything they're saying, but just because they're offering something different than Russification and of Russia. The social structure makes Russia very difficult to govern as well, but also leads to problems for the Tsar ultimately. Probably the most notable feature in sort of the 1900 period was the high percentage of the population who were classed as peasants. You're talking about 77% of the people in Russia being classed as peasants, and there was a very small percentage of people being classed as a professional or like the middle class group. It's actually about 0.5%, it's less than 1%. Urbanites people that are small tradesmen, shopkeepers, white-collar workers and artisans, skilled craftsmen and things like that are included in this. Cossacks are regarded as a separate ethnic group. They are loyal to the Tsar. And just in case you come across it as well, we've got kulaks, who were peasants who were maybe a little bit more well off. They were the top level of peasantry, but they were still peasants. They would be able to have enough farmland or enough money to hire maybe labour for their farms, or they might own animals. And pretty much they were detested by the other peasants who could never maybe hope to reach that particularly lofty title. And again, they're going to become important later on. Something that Stalin is going to use as class warfare will involve the kulaks and things like that, so it's just worthwhile keeping that word. Basically, the structure kind of looks like this. 77% of them are peasants. You've then got the merchant and honoured citizens making up less than 1%. You've got the urbanites, which are making up about 10%, nearly 11%. You've got the Cossacks, and then the others as well, and then the nobility, which is literally like 1% of the population, but they're the 1% that have the most control. The major percentage of the population is the peasantry, and they don't have any control on almost anything in their lives. So this cartoon actually shows really nicely how the sort of structure of Russia kind of was at this point in time. So right at the very top of the pyramid you have the Tsar and his wife, and then you have the kind of nobility and things like that underneath at this kind of level here. You then have the clergy and the church and things on the next level here. And then you have the army, which we're going to come back to. They are quite important, just kind of on this level. Below them, you have the rest of the nobility. And then under them, at the very bottom of the pyramid, you've got the people that are keeping everything up, pretty much, which is the workers, the merchants, these urbanites, and the peasants. So really, Russia at this point in time, you could almost class the majority of people into this like two groups. You've got the rural worker people who are the peasants, and then you've got these people in the cities and things like that who again technically are peasants, but they are urbanites, they are the merchants, they are the ones that are doing these things. And again, those two distinct groups are going to become quite important later on when we talk about how the revolution really began and who was involved in it. In terms of the nobility, just over 1% of the population, but own over 25% of the land, which seems very unfair. They were extremely rich with very large estates that the peasants worked on. Most of them actually don't necessarily live in their estates, they live in Moscow or St. Petersburg because that's where the good things were happening and that's where the parties and the interesting things were. Some had very important government jobs, but largely it was because of their position. So they were born into wealthy families and were given these important jobs as a result of that, rather than the fact that they had any real ability. Which quite often meant, for the Tsar anyway, a lot of his advisors and a lot of the people that were important for the rule of the country were actually people that were not necessarily the best for the job. And there was no real way for anyone else to get into that sort of point in time and develop. They were definitely, the nobility, firm supporters of the system as it was, because they were obviously the ones on top, and they were really fearful for any sort of change, especially in the possibility of land ownership being transferred to the people that worked the land, aka the peasants, because this would take away not just the stranglehold the nobility had, but also how the nobility kind of kept control by having control of the land, this arable land that could be used for farming and things. So they didn't want to give that up, and they were very much against that in general. The middle class group of Russia, small in number, the lack of education and industry and the sort of continuing concentration on agriculture, which is what Russia really was, it was an agricultural nation, meant that there wasn't actually a very big demand for a middle class. There was no real middle class development there, but it was slowly growing. The merchants, the bankers, the industrialists and things are the ones that start to become this more developing middle class. They had a good lifestyle, quite large homes, they had varieties of food and cultural life, and they also included the professional class, so doctors, lawyers, teachers. This is also a growing class of people, and they're beginning to play quite a significant role in local government and in politics, because like if you think back to Britain, and you think back to hire and the British topic, like the people in Britain who are now starting to work in these factories and contribute to the sort of situation of Britain and wondering why they don't have more of a say, the same thing is happening in Russia. You have this growing middle class who are living a kind of a better quality of life. They are able to pay into the economy, they are a significant part of this economy, and they are now starting to think, well, why don't we have more of a say on how Russia's being controlled and governed? They are developing a political voice, for example. The poor repressed peasants on the other side, definitely the largest group. They had a very hard and unremitting sort of lifestyle on very small patches of land, or working on the estates of the nobility. Again, they either can't own their own land or they're renting land. It's very difficult for them to own land, and if they do, it's not very big. Before 1861, we said they had been serfs, people who were owned by masters, so owned by this nobility, and they were bought and sold with the land that they lived on. So if you were a noble person and you sold your farm with your serfs, so the people on it transferred ownership. It's not quite slavery, but it's kind of not very far away from it. Poverty and things like that are very common with the serfs and with the peasants later on as well, so that's something to keep in mind. The property was described when it was sold as containing a certain number of souls, which meant number of serfs, rather than the number of acres that you were selling. So that was the main selling point for that. So literally these peasants had in the past been bought and sold, no better than slaves really, or marginally better than slaves is probably a more fair way to put it. They were poor, they were illiterate, they were uneducated. Some of them were obviously more well off than others. On good years, they got by, but they were very reliant on good harvests. Disease is very common, it is very regular, epidemics happen and kill many quite a lot of the time. It's not particularly strange to have an entire group of serfs or peasants taken out by disease like cholera and things like that. A lot of them are living in debt for rent and things, they are living in squalor, the situation is not great. And it's just not a great place to kind of be. In terms of land and agriculture, the agricultural methods are ineffective and backwards, which if you are an agricultural country, that is quite possibly the most damning thing that anybody could actually say. They are using still hand tools and things like that. They are pretty much subsistence farmers who are using a strip system. They grow the land, the crops, and then they strip it bare and then grow again. Very few animals or tools are being used. There's definitely not enough land to go around, and the population keeps increasing, which makes this worse because there's not enough land in the first place. Despite the fact it takes up 1/6 of the world's land mass, not all of that is arable farmland, which means that you can't grow on it. When they were emancipated and they were freed, they had been forced to pay for their land by making annual land payments to the government, and this put a lot of people in debt. So if you wanted to stay on the land that you had maybe been born on and grown up on and you worked on, you had to pay for it to the noble that now owned it. So realistically, you're not really any better off once you're freed if you are a peasant. A lot of the peasants genuinely believed that the land was theirs and they should not be made to pay because they'd been on it for so long and had grown up on it and things like that. And the land repayment debts are one of the main things that caused the Tsar to start to lose control of his people. Now in 1905, which we'll come back to, these land payment debts were cancelled, these land repayments, but again it shows you how the peasants and this idea of land becomes a real flashpoint. In terms of industry, it's low-level industry at the start of the 20th century, but it is growing. By 1914 and the start of the war, Russia has now become the fourth largest producer of coal, iron and steel. Because it industrialised after most other countries, most of its machinery was actually modern and efficient, and they were actually doing quite well, but there were some smaller firms that had more outdated machinery and things like that. Most of the urban workers were young and male, so that actually helps. Some were ex-peasants, but increasingly generations of them were families who'd always been urban workers. They'd moved to these areas to get jobs and were no longer considering themselves peasants, they now considered themselves urban workers. There were large numbers of women who were working in textile factories in Moscow and St. Petersburg, but there was not a particularly great safety level, lots of high numbers of industrial deaths, wages were very low, living conditions were generally appalling, and not a particularly great thing to be involved in. Here you can see a picture of an early Russian factory. Pays better than living on the land, but it's very simplistic. Even the ones that are modernised up to standard in 1914 are, quite busy. There's not a great amount of safety precautions and things put in place, so industrial accidents are going to be quite high. You can see there they're not really wearing any safety things. They've got sort of caps and things on to protect their hair from getting caught in things, but they're not wearing sort of gloves and things like that, or hard hats, or I don't know, whatever they could be wearing to be safe. So a lot of different issues with how Russia was actually at that point in time, with the people, the minority groups, who had power, who had control. All of this is helping lead to the Tsar's downfall. But possibly one of the main reasons why the Tsar ultimately did lose power eventually in 1914 is because of how Russia was being governed. So if you think back to the Tsarist regime in a nutshell, or if you have a think about this image here, these are basically how people see things. You've got the Tsar at the top, the Imperial Council, the ministers and the Senate, the government departments, and then the civil servants and officials, and that's supposed to be the main government at this point in time. We know that it's an autocracy that's ruled by a Tsar who's an absolute leader, supreme power over the people, and genuinely did believe that he was Tsar because he had the divine right to rule. The fundamental laws of Russia stated, Article 1 actually stated, the Emperor of all the Russians is an autocratic and unlimited monarch. God himself ordains that all must bow before his supreme power, not only out of fear, but also out of conscience. So basically, if you are a Tsar, you are a Tsar because you were born to do this. By blood, by right of God, you are the Emperor of all people and you are a complete supreme power. The Imperial Council was designed to advise the Tsar, and the cabinet of ministers did run various departments, but they were responsible to the Tsar, not to a parliament. So if the Tsar decided, that was it, there was no discussion. This meant this entire system of government rested on this one person. It was a very huge bureaucracy of officials that were basically running the empire, and it was a very rigid hierarchy, but it was hugely inefficient, and there was a mass culture of corruption, putting people that were friends in positions of power, putting family members in positions of power just because they were wealthy, which meant ultimately, for this to work, you have to see yourself in a position of power with the ability to actually do it. It isn't really that much different than a dictatorship. The problem is, if your Tsar is not particularly good or able, you're going to have an awful lot of issues. The officials in the government will just run and do what it wants, and any sort of change and things like that ultimately have to go by the Tsar, and he has the final say. So if he says no, which he does quite a lot when it's Alexander II, and then again when it'll be Alexander III, and then again when it'll be Nicholas, he will not allow anything like that to happen. Opposition to the Tsar is not tolerated. Opposition in general is not tolerated. Opposition to the church, to the ministers, to Russia itself is not tolerated. Basically, it is not tolerated. Do not oppose. Political parties at this point in time are illegal. Newspapers and books are censored. Not that it really mattered, because as we saw, most of the population is actually illiterate, but point still remains. Gatherings of 12 or more needed a permit from the police to be allowed. The consequences of breaking any of these rules or of opposing were quite brutal. They used Ochrana to pretty much root out anyone that was likely to cause trouble. There was a system of spies in most workplaces that reported any sort of discussion or revolutionary way of thinking or anything against the Tsar. People who were deemed dangerous or who protested or spoke out were either arrested or exiled to Siberia. Some of the names that you might be familiar with of these particular types of exiles are people like Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin, people that we are going to talk about. They had been exiled for being a little bit too mouthy, shall we say, at various points. Protests, riots, demonstrations, anything like that are broken up quite ferociously by the army, which quite often leads to bloodshed, which is definitely not good. Talking about the army, they are an important point as well, and just really important to know that they are the largest in Europe. Most of the officers in it are nobles. They come from noble backgrounds. Ordinary soldiers were conscripts who were taken from the villages and were required to serve for 7 years of active duty and then 8 years in reserve. They were subservient to the officers and they didn't have very many rights at all. You couldn't ride in first or second class on railways or go into most restaurants or cafes, for example, if you were a soldier in the army. Pay was very poor, so a lot of soldiers ended up growing their own food and they more or less lived on tea and soup and bread, and that was pretty much it. They pretty much stayed loyal to the regime despite this. They were used to suppress disturbances and revolts, but as time kind of goes on, they become increasingly more disenchanted about being used as a police force. And what you have to remember as well is quite a lot of these people, especially when it's more of these urbanites and these urban workers starting to rebel, are peasants that maybe have come from the same place as these new urban workers. So they're being asked to fire upon their own people, which is very, very difficult for them. Now, ultimately the Tsar will survive in 1905 as a result of them, but because many of these ex-peasants did not like putting down these peasant revolts, morale was very, very low. And when 1917 comes round in February, the army are not willing to side with the Tsar the same way as they had in 1905. One section, however, of the army was, and always would be, which is the Cossacks. They were utterly loyal to the Tsar. They were from the Don area of Russia. They turned against anyone in the empire when asked by the Tsar, and they made up the very best cavalry units in the army. Now, they were quite feared because they had a reputation of being quite ruthless and very brutal cavalry kind of people. So, Tsarist rule is underpinned by kind of 3 key principles. The autocracy, so Tsar's been appointed by God, rule the country without constraints according to their ideas of duty and what was right. They reject any idea that their power rested on the consent of the people. On nationality, so this idea that Russians were a distinct group, superior culture in ways of life compared to everyone around them, which meant that the Russians should predominate the empire, and Russification was a natural and a good thing because you were making these people civilized, you were making them into Russians, which was the best that they could hope to be. So this idea of Russianness is emphasised by the Orthodox Church and through Russification. It's the Tsar's job to preserve this national identity and to indeed strengthen it. And then we've got Orthodoxy, which is the Russian Orthodox Church, the true Christian faith. It's like the Russian branch of Christianity, and it supports and emphasises the divine right of the Tsars to rule. Now, what you can kind of see with each of these 3 key principles is each one links into the other, and each one always comes back to the first one. So because of that, it was very difficult for Russia to change in any way, because it meant it would have to actually take away the idea of Russification, so that limited nationality, the idea that the Tsar needed the consent of the people, which then limited that one, and the idea that he was not in fact like God, which then underlined that one, and it made it very difficult for the Tsar to know really what to do. You also have this idea that Russia is quite backwards in comparison with some of the Western European powers, and the Crimean War had actually confirmed this. So from 1840 there's a lot of debate that the Tsars have to try and deal with about what way should Russia move forward. Russia was kind of seen by some to be exactly like the West, just a little bit behind them, and these Westerners viewed this as an idea that they could adopt some of the political and economic institutions and values from the West and then build a stronger Russian state as a result. The Slavophiles, on the other hand, took a kind of different approach to this. They believed that Russia had its own rich culture, and this obviously was transmitted through the Russian Orthodox Church, and they had their own communal institutions, and they argued that Russia should maintain its own traditions and not try to adopt any of these kind of Western views whatsoever. So they rejected the Western parliamentarism. They don't want the Tsar bound by a constitution because it's against key pinnacle point number 1 and key point number 3, the autocracy and the teachings of the Church. So Russia was actually divided right away on what was the best approach. One is take some bits from the West, and the other is pretty much keep going as they're going, because otherwise you have to change everything about Russia, and they weren't very keen on that. So, if you're thinking about Alexander III then, with all of this in mind, we obviously need to think about how the Tsars did try to make some changes. So if you have a look at the textbook, page 10, you can have a look at the reforms that we talked about Alexander II bringing in. There's some information and a mind map for you to do there. So the first task that you should really do with this is to read that information and copy the mind map, and then using page 11 of the textbook, create a similar mind map for the same thing for Alexander. So you can see here, these are kind of the reforms that he had put in place, and then why his assassination was significant. So that's what you're looking for in the textbook. Once you've done that, have a read about Alexander III, what he actually did to repress things, and make a similar mind map about his repression and why that was key as well. So you've seen how two Tsars kind of try to deal with things. We've looked at Alexander II and his sort of reformist things, and we've looked at Alexander III and his complete change on his father's sort of whole ideas. It's a kind of a key thing to think about maybe who you think was right, which one do you think would have been the better leader for Russia, and we can kind of come back to that as a discussion point. But the weaknesses of the Tsar in general is one of the key points when we're looking at why ultimately the Tsarist regime collapsed in February 1917. So you have to think about how Nicholas kind of came to power and things as well. When he came to power after his father's death, he was unprepared. He came to the throne quite unexpectedly. His father died from a kidney condition, and he was very, very upset about this. He was a very poor leader. One of his own ministers actually is on record as having said that he was unfit to run so much as a village post office, never mind a whole country. And he was stubborn. He was merciless. He was utterly ruthless with opposition, because that's how his father had taught him. He, like his father before him, was anti-Semitic, so against Jews, and he did definitely 100% believe in this divine right of the Romanovs to rule, because that's how he'd been brought up. So Nicholas, poor Nicholas, bit of a story time for him. When he actually came to the throne, when his father died, he was 29 years old, and historians will agree on this. It'd be a really good point if you want an extra task to do, to go away and see if you can find which historians. They agreed that he was unprepared. He actually wept when he was told that his father had died, and it wasn't not just because he was upset about the death of his father, it's because he claimed, I'm not ready. He didn't feel that he was ready to take over. He had very little knowledge or experience, he was quite timid, but he was very stubborn, and he had very sort of stubborn beliefs in moral rightness of the autocracy and God-given powers. He thought that that was the only thing he was definitely 100% sure of, and the thing that he would most defend, which in a time where you really need your Tsar to change is probably not the best attribute for you to have. As we said in the Who's Who sort of introduction PowerPoint, at his coronation 100,000 people actually were killed when they were trying to actually get a glimpse of him, and drunken troops opened fire onto the celebrating crowd. What I didn't tell you at that point was that meanwhile he actually carried on with the banquet, leading a lot of people at the time to think he didn't really care about the Russian people. He'd been told what had happened, and he didn't want to go outside and make sure people were all right or show face or anything like that. He just continued on with the coronation banquet with the nobility. So this sets kind of a seed of doubt about the Tsars in an already cracking sort of Tsarist regime ground quite early on in Nicholas's reign, which is going to become ultimately very difficult for him because he cannot shake this idea. Even though the church has taught the people from a very young age to respect and support the Tsars, the fact that he has done this and then later on will do similar situational things means that the people start to realise that he is not the little father of the people that the church have promised them that he is supposed to be. So this mind map, the inadequacies of Nicholas II, is one that you should copy for your notes. He had an inability to make decisions. He was unwilling to engage in politics or to read government reports because they made him sad. He had no organisational skills, unfit to run a village post office, which is a really good key quote. He was weak and very easily swayed both by his ministers and by his wife, who wanted him at home, not in sort of parliamentary meetings. He was obstinate, which is a fantastic way of saying he was so stubborn that it was almost impossible to get him to move once his mind was made up. From the start, he was determined not to change. He actually said, and this is a direct quote from him, so you can use that in an essay as a primary source, he said, "I shall devote all my strength to maintaining the autocracy for the good of the nation as firmly and unflinchingly as my father," which doesn't bode well, considering they're at a point where they will actually need to change. He was very heavily influenced by the same tutor and advisor that his father had been, whose personal belief was that democracy and elections would end the Russian Empire, and that kind of was passed on through both the tutor and Nicholas's father to him, which he then kept going. Ideologically, he was incapable of accommodating this new middle class of people who would have any sort of political thought, because it didn't cross his mind that people would want to have any sort of political thought. He himself didn't, so why would other people? So he's not going to be able to accommodate them, let alone control the more demanding working and peasant class of people in his country. The country that he now has inherited is actually a very different one that his grandfather was trying to change. It is a very oppressed and very sort of strained environment that he has come into, and he is completely inadequate for this job. So make a copy of this PowerPoint slide because it is a very important mind map, and pause the video so that you can do that, and then keep going after you have finished. Task for you then, again, pause this so that you can see it, go to page 13 in the textbook, and there are 5 sources, 1.10 to 1.15, and some tasks for you to do which are using historiography. If you see any historiography that you quite like amongst these people are saying, make a note of who it was that said it, and maybe even just a short quote from it that you can put into your historiography file that you can maybe use for an essay later on. So pause the video and complete this, and then come back at roughly 54:24. On top of the Tsar's issues, you've got the Tsarina Alexandra, which is her pictured here. She is another problem for the Tsar. She never was liked by the Russian people, or by the Russian court for that matter. So the general population didn't like her, and the higher up population didn't like her either. She was born from German royalty, She was Protestant. She had converted to the Russian Orthodox Church and tried to learn Russian customs. She was always considered an outsider, despite the fact that Alexander III had actually insisted upon meeting her and giving the blessing to her as his son's wife. Even from his deathbed, he had actually gotten up and dressed in full uniform and regalia and everything, which had left him exhausted for days afterwards. She was never accepted. She didn't care for court much, and she pretty much just demanded that her husband be home in the evenings, emphasising this idea of detaching the Tsar from the world around him. She didn't see why the Tsar should have to be part of the rest of the world when he was so much better than the rest of them. The main kind of point to think about this is that a god does not walk amongst mortals, and that was the sort of ideal that she had taken from her understanding of the Tsar and the Tsar's customs. She genuinely firmly believed that the Tsar was appointed by God and should not share his power, even with the people who were his servants or advisors, and she was massively influential over Nicholas, which was not actually always a good thing. At crucial moments, she would argue against a move towards any sort of constitutional monarchy and urge her husband to kind of assert his autocratic will in the fear that she would be witness to him losing authority and losing power. Almost a kind of fall from grace sort of situation that she didn't want to be part of. So despite the Tsar's initial attempt to keep opposition at a very minimal point, it did actually start to emerge in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Examples of this would be the People's Will, which was a group who planned to bring down the government through terrorist acts. It had been members of that particular movement who had assassinated Tsar Alexander. It was members of similar terrorist groups who had planned assassinations of Alexander III, one of which had been Lenin's older brother. They were found before the act could happen and were executed for the assassination attempt. But new revolutionary parties such as the Social Democrats start to grow up around the ideology of philosophers such as Karl Marx, where they were starting to see how Russia could start to develop in a slightly more different way, and Marx's ideals of going through a process, ultimately getting to what he'd determined to be this like utopia of socialism and capitalism into a sort of a communist state, was what they were trying to see as a way forward for Russia. It's an interesting idea because it's not quite Western, but it is sort of taking the Western views and keeping the cultural aspect of Russia. So it's taking these Western and these Slavophile views and almost kind of making them meet in the middle. Liberals also growing up to oppose the Tsar, mainly from the middle class. They want a parliamentary style system that would basically recreate a constitutional monarchy, so like what we actually have in Britain and what they had in Britain at the time. That's what their view was for. There are three main groups then for opposition. So the many middle class people want greater democracy, and Britain has a king but also a parliament, so these are the liberals or the cadets. You've got two other groups, more violent and believing that the answer is complete revolution. The Socialist Revolutionaries, or these SRs, are much more of a radical group. They want to give the huge estates of the nobility to the peasants. They've got wide support from the countryside and also in the towns, and are responsible for the assassination of 2 officials and lots of the Okhrana, the secret police force that we talked about. The Socialist Democratic Party was smaller, more disciplined, and they are the ones following the ideas of Karl Marx. They split into 2 sub-parties in 1903, which are going to become important later on, which are the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. The Bolsheviks believe it is the job of their party to pretty much create revolution, whereas the Mensheviks think that revolution is ultimately where they're going to head, but that Russia is actually not ready for it at that point in time. At this point then, there's the handout attached to the instructions for this PowerPoint on page 20 to 24 of the textbook to complete the focus route task 4. So pause the video, complete that focus route and come back to it, or if you're watching everything, make a note that this is what you have to do for that task. Another issue in terms that we've kind of already spoke about in terms of the way the Tsar controlled Russia and ultimately helped lead to his downfall was the Russian Orthodox Church. For various reasons, it's independent of the Pope and Rome, it's got its own traditions and customs. It owns a very large amount of land and property, so it is very wealthy, and it includes a lot of superstition and mysticism at this point in time. Like, for example, holy men that had powers given to them by God. Rasputin is one such holy man, but we'll come back to talk about him in a bit more detail. It was very closely linked to the Tsarist sort of system, supported this divine right, which we've talked about, and it did teach and encourage the general population to obey the Tsar as they would a god. A government committee, the Holy Synod, which was controlled by the Tsar's minister, also controlled the church, which meant that they were pretty much part of the government at this point. Very conservative and completely against change in general. They control primary education, and the majority of Russian people were religious, so they have an inordinate amount of control over Russia as a society at this point in time. In terms of their economic policy, we have Sergei Witt here, financial minister from 1892 to 1905. He had actually had a plan for modernisation and industrialisation, which involved quite a lot of heavy investment in industrial developments to try and promote a kind of a spiral of upward growths. He thought profits would then be invested in infrastructure, but that it required capital machinery from abroad to basically be paid for with foreign loans, largely from France, and heavy taxation of peasants on what he called essential items, so kerosene, salt, alcohol and things like that. This caused pressure and a lot of resentment because they couldn't pay for it. Workers' wages were kept deliberately low, again to fund these developments, but again led to quite a lot of resentment from the urban workers. So you've got resentment to the economic developments from both peasantry and urban workers, which again, majority of the... Okay, so just a kind of some tasks and things like that to give you a wee bit more detail to try and use for sort of essay writing and things as well. If you go to page 15 to 17 of the textbook, there is some information and a focus route table there like this for you to look through, which talks about the economic policies of Sergei Witt and whether or not the policy was a good thing or it was you could be critical of it, and you can fill that information in there and put that into your notes. So pause the video, use the textbook and complete that task. So ultimately what we're seeing is there's a lot of challenges that are facing the Tsarist regime at this point in time. The government faced challenges from the four sort of social groups: the peasants, the workers, the national minorities, the intelligentsia, middle class and the gentry. A lot of difficulty there. So page 18 in the textbook again gives you some more information. You should try to make about 5 bullet points under each of the 4 headings and use that to complete the focus route on pages 18 and 20, questions 1 to 3. Unfortunately, in 1902 there was an international slump which caused huge problems for the economy of Russia. There was no market for the goods. The Russian workers and peasants were too poor to actually buy domestic made products at this point in time. It led to factory closures and to high unemployment rates. It was also compounded by poor harvests that year, so again a lot of issues with the peasants as well as the urban workers and a lot of resentment as well. On top of this, you have the Russo-Japanese War. Ultimately, it was the Tsar's plan to expand his sphere of influence as Tsars had done before him, and try and distract people from the domestic issues. So these economic slumps, this problem with Russification that was still continuing, and Sergei Witt's sort of economic things that were causing a lot of pressure and unhappiness. Apparently it is said that there is nothing quite like a war to keep people's attention away from domestic issues and things like that. So that's what the Tsar planned to do. He planned to attack Japan and ultimately try to expand his sphere of influence, but it didn't actually work out the way he had planned, because they were more or less hammered by the Japanese navy. Huge defeats against the Russian fleet, very, very, very bad. Japan was viewed as inferior, so Russia was utterly humiliated on the superpower kind of front at that point in time, and the Tsar looked really inadequate, and it made him look really particularly weak as well, because he was obviously the one that had started this, and obviously it's a testimony that his ministers and the people in control of the army that he has appointed or that are with him are not actually able to do that if a backwards nation like Japan were able to ultimately defeat this great war-like nation that Russia apparently looked like they were going to be. The Russo-Japanese War is a fantastic point to keep in mind about the 1905 revolution, so you should pause this video and you should watch this animation, which you can see the link for here. It's a really good one. It's 8 minutes long, but it's a very good one to kind of show what happened, with the Russo-Japanese War. So stop this video and watch that one, and maybe make some notes about what you see happening during the war, which will help you in a bit more detail. Okay, and kind of final task to look at, the activity box on page 25. There are some sources on page 25 and some fact files on page 26 and to 27 for you to have a look at and complete those tasks as well. Okay, so just a quick summary then. We've said that Tsarist Russia was obviously a very vast country, very diverse population, which made it very difficult to govern. It's an autocracy which is ruled by a Tsar, who's the head of this large and very unresponsive and very ineffectual bureaucracy. They had used repressive measures and secret police to keep control for a number of years. Russia needed to modernise and industrialise if it was going to compete with the developed countries of the Western sort of world, and Western Europe in particular, and maintain its position as a major world power. The task of modernising Russia was one that, to be perfectly honest, even the most able leader would find very difficult, and unfortunately Nicholas II was not a good leader for these particular circumstances. Sergei Witt did set in motion a process of modernisation, but was forced from office by conservative court influences, and the problem caused by rapid industrialisation was an issue, followed by this economic slump or recession that made things worse. Tsarist Russia faced challenges from different groups in Russia: the peasants, the urban workers, the national minorities, the intelligentsia, all of them engaging in forms of political opposition to the government, and all of these groups had different and specific demands which the Tsar was either unable to or unwilling to ultimately accommodate. So that's the challenges of the Tsarist regime, also some of the long-term factors for the Tsar's ultimate downfall. Thank you for your attention. Make sure you go back and complete the tasks, because obviously that's going to give you more information. Some of it we've just kind of glanced over, but that'll give you more detail, and make sure that you kind of have an understanding of this. And then we'll move on to look at 1905. Any questions or anything that you're not sure about, please put a note in the team or let me know and we can chat through things.